The air inside the hearing chamber was heavy and stagnant, hanging over the room like the dust settling after an explosion. Senator John Kennedy leaned forward in his plush leather chair, his elbows resting on the mahogany desk, while his fingers interlaced tightly. He spoke with a slow, deliberate Louisiana drawl that seemed to stretch every syllable into something tangible and thick. It was that peculiar, magnetic rhythm that forces a listener to lean in closer, even when they are already paying full attention. He warned the witness to think carefully before answering, fully aware that the entire American public was watching her every move. The Ethics Committee room was packed beyond capacity, filled with spectators squeezed into a space designed for half as many people. The atmosphere was stiflingly hot and charged with anxiety, with every camera lens in the Capitol trained on the witness stand like a synchronized laser beam. Kennedy held his position on the dais as a legal expert brought in specifically to handle this line of intense questioning. Representative Omar adjusted her microphone, trying to maintain an air of poised confidence despite the pressure. She looked at the senator with an expression that suggested she had faced tough opponents before, and would survive this challenge too. Kennedy locked his eyes on her and asked a sharp question regarding the management of her campaign finances. The entire room seemed to hold its collective breath as the weight of the inquiry settled over the chamber. A profound silence followed the question, as if all the oxygen had been suddenly sucked out of the pressurized room. From the back of the gallery, a clumsy noise echoed where someone dropped an object, shattering the stillness. Omar kept her face composed, being experienced in high-stakes political environments and determined to keep her dignity. Kennedy continued by stating that the data he was about to present was verified and deeply frustrating for the tax-paying citizens. His voice grew steadily louder as he warmed to the subject, sounding like a high-performance engine hitting its stride. He noted that, unlike the Congresswoman, his goal was to get straight to the proven facts of the matter. He offered a smile that lacked any warmth, serving instead as a warning of a tactical legal maneuver. It was the look of a seasoned lawyer who knows he is about to reveal a truth that cannot be easily explained away. He tapped the file folder sitting in front of him 3 times with a slow, deliberate motion to emphasize his point. He stated that any investigation must naturally start with the financial paper trail to understand the reality of the situation. The audience shifted in their seats, leaning forward in anticipation of the evidence that was seemingly about to be revealed. Kennedy opened the file without looking down, keeping his gaze fixed strictly on the witness. He wanted to gauge her immediate reaction as the details of the financial ledgers were prepared for public display. He held up a single document high enough for the cameras to capture the image without revealing the sensitive fine print. He explained that this ledger showed a donation history from a retired nurse named Betty living in Duluth. He allowed the image of an elderly pensioner to settle in the minds of the audience to create an emotional connection. Betty had sent $50, which was a significant sum for someone living on a strict, fixed budget. The silence in the room stretched on as everyone thought about the sacrifice required for such a small gift. Kennedy asked if the Congresswoman understood what that money actually bought for her political machine and personal life. He did not wait for a reply, for the silence in the room gave a profound answer all on its own. Omar sat motionless, wearing a look that shifted between defiance and a calculated defensive posture. Kennedy revealed that the funds had been redirected to pay for personal lifestyle costs for her partner rather than civic causes. He placed the paper down gently, as if it were fragile glass, before leaning back into his chair. He explained that in his home state, using money for purposes other than what was promised is considered a serious breach of trust. A wave of nervous murmuring moved through the room as the crowd understood the implication of his words. Kennedy noted that perhaps things were done differently in Minnesota, but in the South, honor was still the highest priority. His tone remained steady and conversational, as if they were discussing the weather rather than moral failures. Omar clenched her jaw slightly, showing the first sign that the interrogation was getting under her skin. She leaned toward her microphone, speaking with a tone that suggested she was ready to educate someone on their ignorance. She claimed that all campaign expenses were properly recorded and disclosed according to federal laws. Kennedy raised one hand slightly to stop her, not with anger, but with a firm command of the room. He admitted the paperwork was likely filed correctly, but insisted he was talking about ethics, not just administrative compliance. He pulled another document from the binder without needing to look to know what it was. He described Betty as a woman who had spent 4 decades caring for others as a dedicated nursing professional. He emphasized that 40 years is a long time to comfort the sick and promise them that health will return. The room had gone completely silent as the human cost of the political controversy became clear. He reminded everyone that Betty now lived on a small monthly check that barely covered her basic needs. Yet, she had given 50 of those hard-earned dollars because she believed in the Congresswoman's message. Kennedy noted that Betty didn't have cable TV and likely watched speeches online to stay informed about current events. She was convinced the Congresswoman was fighting for overlooked people like herself who had worked hard their entire lives. He paused to let the sadness of that misplaced trust sink into the minds of the listeners. She had sent a handwritten note with her money in the hope that it would help bring about change. Kennedy held up the smaller slip of paper so the cameras could focus on the elderly woman's shaky writing. He read the note, which simply asked that the money be used to fight for people in her situation. Omar gripped the edge of the table until her knuckles turned white as the emotional weight hit her. Kennedy repeated the 4 words from the message in a soft voice that drifted across the quiet room. He put the note down and looked at the witness with an expression of genuine disgust regarding the betrayal. He asked if she wanted to explain to Betty how funding personal wealth helped the working class. Omar opened her mouth to speak, but Kennedy raised his hand again to stop her from breaking the rhythm. He announced that he had the invoices to show exactly where the money went and how it was paid out. He pulled out a stack of papers that served as undeniable proof of the financial transfers. He stated that her political group had paid $250,000 in consulting fees to her husband's firm. He let that massive number hang in the air so everyone could understand the size of the transaction. A sharp gasp came from the audience as the exact amount was revealed to the public for the first time. Kennedy flipped through the pages slowly to show the sheer volume of payments sent to the family member. He explained that most consulting firms bill for concrete items like research papers or strategy guides. He looked up with a dangerous smile and asked what the campaign had actually received for that money. He revealed that the campaign office had told him the payments were only for verbal strategic advice. Kennedy raised an eyebrow in mock surprise that spoken advice could cost such a huge amount of money. He dragged out the words to emphasize how ridiculous the excuse sounded to the average citizen. There were no files or presentations to justify the $250,000 sent to her husband. Omar tried to speak faster and at a higher pitch, signaling she was moving into a defensive mode. She insisted everything was within legal limits, but Kennedy had no interest in technical loopholes. He continued by pointing out that the payments started almost exactly when she married the consultant in question. He highlighted the coincidence that thousands of dollars flowed monthly from donors to her spouse. Kennedy stood up slowly and began to walk around the committee table toward the witness. He moved with the unhurried pace of a man who has total control over the situation. Omar watched his approach with eyes that followed his path like a security camera tracking a threat. He stopped in front of the witness stand and stated that Betty didn't care about transparency laws. He insisted the donor only cared why her money bought luxuries for someone who had everything. He gestured toward the third row of the seating area and asked Betty Henderson to stand up. An elderly woman stood slowly from her seat, using the chair in front of her for balance. The cameras instantly focused on the small, frail lady who had become the center of the inquiry. Kennedy softened his voice and spoke to her as if he were her own son welcoming her home. She offered a small and shy greeting to the room, being unused to such intense attention. Kennedy turned back to Omar, and his voice hardened instantly as he demanded she look the woman in the eye. Omar looked down at her papers and refused to look at the pensioner standing in the audience. The silence lasted for 30 seconds, long enough to become painfully awkward for everyone there. Kennedy walked back to his chair and asked if Betty wanted to say anything to the Congresswoman. An aide rushed over with a microphone because Betty was too far away to be heard. Her hands shook as she took the device, and the assistant had to help her hold it steady. She spoke in a voice that cracked with emotion and the weight of 70 years of life. She simply said that she had put her trust in the Congresswoman to fight for people like her. Betty sank back into her seat as words failed her, and a friend put a comforting arm around her shoulder. The room dissolved into a chaotic noise of angry murmuring as the crowd processed the betrayal. Kennedy sat silently, allowing the anger in the room to build until it filled every corner. When he finally spoke again, his voice cut through the noise with absolute clarity and authority. He asked the Congresswoman, under the threat of perjury, if her husband's firm accepted the money in question. Omar answered quickly and defensively by repeating that all spending was disclosed per federal rules. Kennedy cut her off, only to ask for a simple yes or no answer regarding the receipt of funds. After a long pause, she whispered a single word of confirmation that was barely audible. Kennedy then asked if she could provide any physical work product to justify the payments. When she could not answer, he gathered his papers and prepared to move to the next topic. He announced that there was much more to discuss and opened a fresh binder of evidence. He asked if the people of Minnesota were aware of the immigration issues he was about to bring up. Omar gripped the desk again as the confidence she had entered with began to crack. Kennedy leaned back and offered that dangerous smile again as he prepared for the second round. He stood up and walked toward the back of the room where the general public was seated. He stopped beside a middle-aged man with a graying beard who was wearing a new suit. Kennedy placed a respectful hand on the man's shoulder and introduced him as Muhammad Hassan. He explained that Muhammad was a lawful asylum seeker who had come to America by following every rule. He asked Muhammad how long it had taken him to legally bring his family to the country. The man stood up and answered clearly that it had taken 12 painful years. Kennedy repeated the time frame to let the sheer weight of 12 years sink in. He asked Muhammad to describe what that experience was like for him and his family. Muhammad looked at the Congresswoman with a steady stare while she refused to meet his eyes. He explained that he had applied for sanctuary and waited years just for the first interview. He listed the expensive fees he paid and the forms he filled out to follow the law. He spoke about missing his daughter's childhood birthdays because he was stuck in the bureaucratic process. He noted that by the time his child arrived, she looked at him like a stranger instead of a father. The audience was moved by the heartbreak of a father losing his connection with his child. Muhammad explained that he never used loopholes because he came to America for fairness and legality. He stated that there is no point in coming to a nation for justice if you break the laws to get there. The gallery broke into a short round of applause for the man's honor and patience. Kennedy asked when the family finally arrived, and Muhammad replied it was only recently. He pointed to his daughter in the audience, who was crying silently at the memory of their separation. Kennedy asked the young woman her name, and she whispered that it was Amina. He asked when she last saw her father before coming to America, and she said she was 8 years old. Kennedy turned to Omar and noted that she constantly lectured the country on immigration reform. He compared her speeches with the reality of Muhammad, who had obeyed every single rule she criticized. He pointed out that while Muhammad waited 12 years, she had experienced a much faster path. He clarified he was not accusing her of crimes, but highlighting the unfortunate perception. He stated that it angers people to see rule followers suffer, while others benefit from a broken system. He argued that the system worked for Muhammad, but it worked slowly and painfully because he respected the rules. He walked over to Muhammad and said the issue is not just the process, but the unfairness. He asked Muhammad if he wanted to say anything to the representative who had a different experience. Muhammad voiced his sadness that he waited 12 years while others found shortcuts. He remarked his daughter would never remember him as her father because of the time he lost. Amina began to cry harder and was comforted by the woman sitting next to her in the viewing area. Kennedy went back to his chair and asked Omar if she had waited 12 years or lived in camps. When she did not answer, the silence confirmed the difference in their backgrounds. Kennedy summarized that 2 controversies had now been exposed regarding money and time. He opened a 3rd binder and announced they would now discuss her comments regarding certain American citizens. He walked to a different section of the audience and stood beside a young female teacher. He introduced her as Sarah Goldstein, who had taught history for over 2 decades. He explained that Sarah needed police protection after the congresswoman made comments about Jewish people and money. He asked Sarah to stand and tell the panel what happened at her school. Sarah described finding hateful symbols painted on her classroom door the morning after the social media posts. She explained that her students started asking if she was disloyal to America because of her background. She stated it was crushing to be accused of treason by the children she taught. She revealed that she was forced to take medical leave because the anxiety and fear were overwhelming. The most painful part, she said, was hiding her grandmother's necklace to feel safe in America. She explained that her grandmother was a survivor who had believed this nation was a protected sanctuary. Kennedy walked back to the front of the room with heavy steps as the weight of the story took hold. He looked at Omar, who was now shedding silent tears at the witness stand. He asked if she had considered that her rhetoric might endanger a high school teacher in her own district. He dismissed her excuse that she was criticizing policy and noted that the teacher played no role in policy. He asserted that leaders must realize that questioning the loyalty of a group leads to dangerous consequences. He pointed out that other Jewish families from her district were present in the gallery. Dozens of hands went up in the crowd to show how widespread the fear had become. Kennedy insisted that she offer an apology to Sarah Goldstein for the suffering she endured. Omar stammered a forced apology, stating she was sorry her words were interpreted that way. Sarah stood and told the congresswoman she did not accept the apology as being sincere. The room broke into a standing ovation for the teacher who refused to accept an empty apology. Kennedy waited for the clapping to fade before organizing his papers for the next phase. He stated that 3 issues had been addressed and there were still more matters to cover. He opened a huge file and announced they would discuss the events of September 11th. Omar's aide whispered something to her and then suddenly gathered his things and marched out of the room. Kennedy smiled grimly and noted that she was now alone to face the consequences of her vocabulary. He introduced a retired fire captain named Thomas Brady, who was standing in the back. He explained that Captain Brady had responded to the attacks and lost many men that day. Kennedy asked the captain to share his thoughts on how the congresswoman described the attacks. The captain spoke with a rough voice about his father, who died saving civilians in the towers. He expressed his rage that the Congresswoman described the murder of thousands as merely, "Some people did something." He insisted that his father was a unique person with a name, and not just a vague entity. He said his father saved everyone, regardless of their religion or background, because that is what heroes do. Kennedy stood shoulder to shoulder with the captain and asked Omar if she stood by her phrasing. After a long silence, she finally whispered that she did not stand by that description. The captain refused to say anything more to her because he felt she was not worth his breath. Instead, he told the recording cameras to remember his father's name and that he was an American patriot. The room erupted in cheers again for the firefighter who defended the memory of the fallen. Kennedy remained standing and listed the 4 groups that had been insulted. He opened the final folder and said there was one last scandal to address regarding business and free enterprise. He walked to the audience one last time and stopped beside a tired-looking man named James. He explained that James used to own a hardware store that had been in his family for 3 generations. James described how rioters destroyed his shop during unrest that the Congresswoman had seemingly encouraged. He detailed the financial ruin he faced after paying for repairs until he could no longer keep up. He said his staff lost their jobs and he lost his family legacy because of the chaos. Kennedy asked how much James earned and compared it with the Congresswoman's huge salary and speaking fees. He noted that while James flew on a discount airline, she traveled in first-class luxury. He held up a photo of an employee named Maria, who now struggled to feed her children. He asked Omar if this destruction was the version of justice she had preached about. James walked to the table and placed the key to his foreclosed shop in front of her. He told her to keep the key as a reminder of what her rhetoric had cost his family. The room remained silent as Omar looked at the metal object while tears ran down her face. Kennedy counted the 5 victims and stated that justice had finally been revealed for all to see. He gathered his papers and announced he had no further questions for the witness. The room exploded in the loudest applause of the afternoon as the hearing came to a dramatic end. The echoes of the inquiry sent shockwaves through the political landscape as the footage spread globally. Support for the Congresswoman crumbled as voters saw the real human cost of her actions. Kennedy was praised by many for his methodical dismantling of the narratives that had protected her. The stories of Betty, Mohammed, Sarah, the captain, and James became symbols of a need for accountability. The hearing proved that when simple questions are asked, the truth can be a devastating weapon.